Imagine you're the first mate on a bulk carrier. It's a Tuesday morning in late September. You cleared the Gulf of St. Lawrence 4 days ago, and now you're threading a channel barely wider than your ship through flat farmland east of Montreal. The pilot beside you has done this 400 times. He hasn't slept. He's watching the concrete walls of the first lock materialize through the morning haze, calculating clearance by feel, 8 feet of water on each side. The gates close behind you. Water begins to rise. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ship lifts. Not toward the ocean, away from it, up, into the interior of a continent. By the time you reach your destination, a grain terminal on the far end of Lake Superior, you will have climbed more than 600 feet above sea level. You will be 2,300 miles from the open Atlantic, farther from salt water than most commercial ships ever go. And you will have done it on a scheduled commercial route. That's not exploration. That's the St. Lawrence Seaway on a regular Tuesday. And what it quietly enables, every shipping season, through a corridor that most people couldn't point to on a map, is the movement of raw materials sustaining one of the largest industrial economies on Earth. The system shouldn't work. Not because the engineering is beyond reach. The evidence that it works is literally floating inside those locks right now. But because everything about the geography of North America suggests the industrial heartland of the continent should be sealed, landlocked, inaccessible to ocean freight by any reasonable route. The Great Lakes hold roughly 21% of Earth's surface freshwater. 5 lakes, strung across the center of the continent, connected to each other and eventually to the St. Lawrence River, which flows northeast until it reaches the Atlantic. On a map, this looks like a natural shipping highway between the interior and the ocean. But between Lake Ontario and the sea, the river drops. It narrows. It churns through rapids, so dangerous that French voyageurs named each section individually, because memorizing them was the difference between surviving and not. At Niagara, between Lakes Erie and Ontario, the drop is 167 feet, all at once, over a cliff. The part tourists photograph. The inconvenient part is that for 2 centuries it made the upper lakes completely inaccessible by water from the ocean. Below Niagara, along the upper St. Lawrence, the story wasn't much better. A series of rapids and rock formations that made navigation impossible for anything larger than a canoe. Goods went around them by portage, carried overland, loaded back onto boats, carried again. For most of recorded history, the interior of the continent was sealed at its own river mouth. The cities that grew up around the Great Lakes built their industrial identities around a different kind of ship. Lake freighters, flat, enormous, purpose-built for the specific geometry of the lakes. They moved iron ore from the Mesabi Range in Minnesota to furnaces in Ohio and Pennsylvania. They carried grain from the prairie provinces to export terminals on Lake Erie. They made the Great Lakes Basin one of the most productive industrial corridors in the world. But they couldn't leave. The locks connecting the lakes to the St. Lawrence were too small for ocean vessels. And ocean ships on the other side couldn't get in. The Great Lakes were inaccessible in both directions, a closed industrial circulatory system, vast and productive, sealed from the world by geography it hadn't chosen and couldn't change. Chicago is technically 2,300 miles from the open ocean. It was, and in many ways still is, one of the busiest ports in North America. That sentence doesn't make sense without the Seaway. And the Seaway nearly didn't happen. The question worth asking is why it took until 1959. The engineering wasn't the obstacle. Lock technology had existed for centuries. Dredging was well understood by 1900. The basic concept, a series of locks stepping ships from sea level up to lake level, was never particularly mysterious. What blocked it for 6 decades had almost nothing to do with water. The obstacle was everyone who stood to lose. American railroads had built their entire freight business around the fact that the upper lakes were inaccessible by sea. They moved what water couldn't. If ocean ships could sail directly to Chicago, the rates railroads charged for the same cargo would collapse. That lobbying campaign lasted 60 years, through 4 presidential administrations and more congressional hearings than anyone has counted. The ports of New York and Baltimore had the same calculation from a different direction. Their position as the eastern gateway for transatlantic trade, cargo arriving by ship then moving inland by rail through their terminals, depended on there being no direct water route that bypassed them. A seaway that let ships reach the interior directly would cut them out of the transaction entirely. For 6 decades, political opposition held because the math worked in its favor. What broke it wasn't persuasion. Canada broke it. I've gone through the congressional testimony from this period, and one detail kept nagging at me. In 1951, Canada announced it would build the Seaway unilaterally, on the Canadian side of the river. Without American participation, without American cost-sharing, without any American input on tolls or routing or control. The project that American politicians had blocked for a generation would simply exist. It would just be entirely Canadian. Congress approved American participation within 18 months. The math became obvious the moment the alternative became concrete. A seaway controlled entirely by Canada meant American cargo paying Canadian fees to reach American ports. That outcome was worse than the seaway itself. The 60-year debate resolved in 60 days once the incentive structure shifted. Nobody changed their analysis. The consequences of saying no finally got specific. Construction began in 1954. It immediately ran into something nobody had fully priced in. Building a navigable channel through the upper St. Lawrence required flooding a stretch of river valley in Ontario. Entire villages went underwater. More than 6,500 people were relocated. Farmers, tradespeople, families whose roots in that land went back generations. Some towns were demolished. A few were rebuilt higher up the riverbank, renamed, repositioned on new roads. The displacement was organized, compensated, and documented. It was also permanent. The canal opened in April 1959. The first ocean-going vessel reached Duluth that same year. What they built is a chain of 15 locks distributed across 2,300 miles of water. Some sit on the American side of the border, some on the Canadian side. Some lift ships up from sea level, some lower them between lakes at different elevations. Together, they step a vessel from the Atlantic up to 600 feet above sea level and hold it there across the length of the Great Lakes. The mechanism works the way a staircase works, except each step is 766 feet long, 80 feet wide, and filled with water. Those dimensions were set in 1954. They were generous for the ships of that era. They were considered future-proof. The strangest part, when you look at the actual numbers, is how precisely wrong that turned out to be. Modern bulk carriers that could benefit most from the Seaway's route run 800 to 1,000 feet long. The container ships that dominate global trade are often wider than a Seaway lock's entire interior. The vessels that defined international shipping in 1980 can't use the system. The vessels that define it today can't use it either. The Seaway's dimensional limits have a name in the industry: Seaway Max. It describes the largest vessel that can physically transit the corridor. Every ship designed to use the Seaway has been built to those 1954 specifications, because those specifications are still the specifications, unchanged across 7 decades. What still moves through, despite the constraints, is substantial. About 160 million metric tons of cargo per year, iron ore that feeds steel mills in Hamilton and Gary, wheat that leaves Thunder Bay and arrives in Rotterdam months later as flour, limestone, coal, salt, aggregate, the heavy bulk commodities that don't care about transit time, that fit the economics of slow, cheap water freight. One number that anchors the scale: the port of Duluth Superior, at the far western tip of Lake Superior, handles more cargo annually than most people would guess for a city most Americans couldn't find on a map. By volume, it ranks among the largest ports in North America. But the container revolution, which reshaped global trade over the past 50 years, largely bypassed the system. A standard 20-foot container fits through a Seaway lock. A modern container ship carrying 10,000 of them doesn't. The cargo that drives the contemporary economy, electronics, machinery, consumer goods, manufactured components, mostly goes around. Through the Panama Canal, through Pacific ports, on trucks across 2 time zones. The longer path, because the shorter path has an 80-foot limit. What this shows is something about how infrastructure decisions compound. The people who set those lock dimensions in 1954 weren't careless. They were engineering for the future they could see, using the vessel sizes they had with the commercial logic of the era they were living in. But infrastructure built for the future you can see tends to become a constraint at precisely the moment the future you couldn't see arrives. The Seaway didn't fail. It succeeded completely for the version of commerce it was designed for. Then commerce changed. The Seaway has a second constraint that no amount of engineering can address. It closes every winter. Not as a policy choice, because the St. Lawrence freezes. The locks freeze. Moving tens of thousands of tons of floating steel through a channel of ice isn't an operational challenge, it's a physical impossibility. From late December through late March, the system shuts. Ships that can't exit before the ice sets are icebound. Cargo planned for January arrives in April. For supply chains that depend on consistent delivery, a 4-month gap isn't an inconvenience. It's a structural condition that reshapes everything built around it. Grain elevators at Thunder Bay hold an entire season's production because the ships can't come in winter. Steel mills on the lakes carry inventory buffers that competitors on tidewater don't need. The seasonal rhythm of the Seaway is baked into the economics of every business that depends on it, often invisibly, often without those businesses fully understanding why their cost structures look the way they do. Something unexpected is now happening to that rhythm. The ice season is shortening. The Seaway's operating window has extended by roughly 2 weeks over the past 4 decades. Some recent winters, the freeze barely develops at all. This sounds, on the surface, like straightforwardly good news for shippers. The engineers aren't entirely sure it is. The infrastructure was designed for a specific freeze-thaw cycle. The locks depend on certain ice conditions for maintenance windows that now sometimes don't materialize. The river ecosystems, spawning patterns, water levels, shoreline dynamics are calibrated to a seasonal rhythm that is shifting. The Seaway is getting more operating time than it was built for. Whether aging concrete and aging gate mechanisms can absorb that additional stress without compounding existing maintenance problems is a question that the people responsible for the system watch carefully, without a clean answer. Here's the take that will get pushback. The case for expanding the Seaway, rebuilding the locks to modern dimensions, renegotiating the binational treaty, bringing the corridor into the container era has been made continuously since the 1970s. Studies commissioned. Working groups convened. The conclusion in nearly every case has been that the economics are marginal. The locks need to be large enough to attract the ships. The ships need certainty about traffic before redesigning their routes. Neither side moves first. The system that took 60 years to approve once is now caught in a different kind of stalemate, not lobbying opposition, but the absence of a clear winner from the investment. And the communities built around the existing system would not all benefit equally from an expansion. The grain elevator in a specific port town exists partly because a ship stops there at a bottleneck. Remove the bottleneck, and the ship might not stop. The constraint that limits the whole system is also the economic logic that sustains specific pieces of it. That's not a coincidence. That's how constraints work in mature infrastructure networks. What do you think? Is the Seaway's real problem the lock dimensions or the economic interests that have built themselves around them? Drop your answer in the comments. One detail that stuck with me: the Binational Commission studying Seaway expansion has been publishing interim reports since 1992. 34 years of interim reports, and counting. Will the US and Canada finally agree on a Seaway expansion before the existing locks reach the end of their engineered lifespan? Comment yes or no. The infrastructure timeline makes this more urgent than most people realize. The principle the Seaway illustrates isn't specific to canals or locks or North America. It shows up in every infrastructure network built at one historical moment to serve one version of commerce, and then asked to serve all the versions that came after. Geography creates the opening, infrastructure fills it, and once a system becomes load-bearing, once economies organize around it, supply chains assume it, cities grow against its edges, it stops being a tool and becomes a given, part of the landscape, something to route around rather than through. If you want to understand why the industrial heartland of North America developed the specific geography it has, why Pittsburgh made steel and Chicago made machines, and Duluth shipped ore and Cleveland built cars, you need to understand the Seaway, not as a canal, as a decision made at a specific political moment under specific pressures that locked in a specific continental geography for the next century. That's what Mapped is for. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling that thread. The pilot who guided your ship into the first lock that Tuesday morning has guided another ship back out by now. The same gates, the same 8 feet of clearance on each side, the same concrete that has been doing this work since 1959. The United States and Canada have been discussing Seaway expansion since the 1970s. The discussions are ongoing. Meanwhile, the ship that couldn't fit, the one carrying the containers, went around, through Panama, through Los Angeles, on a truck across 2 time zones. The corridor still holds, the grain still moves, the season still ends in December, when the ice comes back. For now, the gates close right on schedule.